can obviously hear me, so it doesn't make any difference. You're all moving, but I'm frozen. Maybe there's a metaphor there.
Hello, Daniel. Thanks for joining.
Well, it's not quite 4 o'clock yet, so maybe we can wait a couple of minutes.
Definitely. I was thrilled to see that it was the tropical one that led the charge, because there is a lot to say about the atmospheric conditions here and how to affect the body and the whole set. You cannot.
Well, indeed, that's a nice thought.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even the Institute of Psychiatry, where I supposedly have an honorary post, no longer respond to my emails because they don't really want a conversation. They don't want a conversation. The papers that are published, which assume a universal mental health around the world, i.e. a Western one, virtually never reference any skeptical views of that. They're a functioning system and they don't really want to know, and they certainly don't want to argue with me anymore. I suppose I've mocked them a bit too much. But one has to realize how this system just plows on. Huh? But the other key players have been, I think, the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, some of the big institutes in the US, and Harvard. Harvard has, curiously enough, made a turn back to biology, even with Arthur Kleinman and Byron Good, the world-famous cultural psychiatrist and medical anthropologist, respectively. They became defenders of global mental health, and I can't quite establish why. Not exactly why. Except they seem to feel they're doing something. Well, are they doing what the people on the ground want them to do? That may be another question. Anyway.
Dennis, we wait for a few minutes if that's okay with you, like only 2, 3?
That's all right. I'll be back in a moment.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
I do, yeah. And I can see as well.
Okay. So now I switch off camera, I think.
If that's okay, Dennis, I will introduce you very briefly, and you present yourself more completely. I would just say.
But lines. Not now, later.
Yeah, later.
Okay. Okay.
Later, as in 5 minutes, if that's okay. Yeah. Welcome, Lucy. Is that you from the Institute?
What's IIPDW?
It's the Institute of Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal.
Oh. Well, that's another story.
Yeah. It's linked. I would say it's quo bono. As I don't know. I'm not expert as all of you. But is that fine that we wait for 4 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Are you recording these, Enric, in any language? English, Spanish, or what?
I am recording it without the subtitles, but the subtitles are gonna be. I'm gonna have access, and I'm gonna translate them as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something good about the Google Meets. Yeah.
Well, about 25 years ago, I came to Madrid and gave a lecture in Spanish.
Oh.
God knows what it stood like. But I used to work in Nicaragua.
Uh-huh.
During the war, during the Sandinista revolution. That was
Wow. Oh, wow. How come you ended there?
I did there, well, for the Nicaraguan Human Rights Commission, who was a Sandinista organization. I worked for them. But then later I went back and did a study of war-wounded men on both sides, both the Sandinista ex-army and the Contras, who had taken amnesty. Both of them, who were wounded, paraplegic, but, and did a study of the two groups of young men. And of course, surprise, surprise, they were all the same kind of young men.
Yeah.
This is the big gringo that started this one, as we know.
That is the one that is invaded at night?
Where, in Nicaragua?
Yeah.
Who invaded at night? They were,
Yes, at some point they overthrow a leader, no? Or I may be completely mistaken. I have no idea.
I don't know about the reference invaded at night.
Wait a second. I'm looking for that.
Oh, okay.
No, that's the one. That is the Banana Wars. I'm completely mistaken. No, forget about that.
Okay.
Wait, in 81 they did again. Yeah. Anyhow.
81.
The Sandinistas.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. They took power in 76, I think. Of course, Ortega is still there. Oh, he's back. The president of Nicaragua.
It's that fine if we start in 1 minute?
Is that Alison Pollock there? Alison?
Yes.
I don't know. We've never met, but I've obviously admired your work from afar in trying to save the NHS.
Not doing a very good job.
No. We could talk about that. Yeah. Hi, Alison.
Sorry, I can't see who's speaking to me on the screen.
Well, mine's frozen. My name's Derek Summerfield.
Oh, Derek, how wonderful. Lovely. You're a great friend and colleague of Neil, my great friend Neil. Yeah, lovely. Yeah. That's really nice. I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk. In fact, I've just been finishing a paper with Lisa Cosgrove on depression instruments, and we've been citing your work anyway.
Oh, really?
And Lisa is also here.
Oh, there's Lisa. Great, there's Lisa.
Yeah, depression is my bugbear.
In and out, Derek, because I only got a notification from Leah very late of this, so I'm going to be dipping in and out. But really great, thank you. I'm going to turn off my camera now.
Are you?
Just for sound. Yeah.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Hello, Lisa.
Hello. Yes, it's just such a pleasure. Hi, Danius.
Hi, Lisa.
Thank you for joining. Danius, the floor is yours.
Actually, maybe you can all advise, Derek, maybe you can advise. We're trying to do known unknowns for what's happening to mental health services in England, a BMJ webinar. Maybe you can advise them who's really good person to talk to. I'll try and email you afterwards.
Yeah, fine, separately. Yeah, do.
Okay, thank you.
That's cool.
If that's fine, we give the mic to Danius. Yes?
What's it? Hang on a moment.
Yeah.
Aren't I next?
You are next.
Oh, I see. I mean, it's 4 o'clock European time, isn't it?
That's it.
I don't mind. Does Danius want to go first then?
Wait, Daniel, do you go now, or you prefer to do it the other way around? It's completely fine.
No, it's up to you. I think that Derek has.
Yeah, the order had me first.
Then that's
I'm a bit
it.
pushed
Then
the
I
other
was
end of the-
mistaken.
of
Direct
things.
your
I
first,
don't mind,
then
I don't
venues.
mind.
Let's go ahead. Yeah, that's my bad. I didn't see it correctly. That's it.
Okay. I don't have any AVAs. I'm just going to talk to you, but we seem a fairly select group. The discussion of the title Political Abuse of Psychiatry, obviously I'm mostly going to talk about things that are not necessarily intended abuse, or at least they're not necessarily conspiratorial, though they come out that way. When people think about the political abuse of psychiatry, they think immediately of the Russian case, which I won't be discussing, where they invented a category called sluggish schizophrenia, whose cardinal symptoms were refusal to accept the communist system. And for this, they were interned and given high doses of antipsychotic medication. The only other example, this is, by the way, the only example I know of a national government creating a psychiatric category was, in fact, the Blairite Labour government in Britain. This is just one more thing I have against them, who more or less were responsible behind the scene for the creation of a category called something like dangerously severe personality disorder, a subcategory of people who would get a particular kind of treatment. They created this condition out of nowhere, and it came, and for a while there were centers, and there was probably a professor of dangerously severe, and then it all kind of melted away. The way things do in psychiatry, there's sort of waves, aren't there, one way or another. Okay, so it's not that sort of abuse. But what I want to start with is the relationship between neoliberal philosophy, on the one hand, and the medicalization of everyday life, and through that then to the effective abuses, as it happens, of non-Western peoples around the world by the insistence by the psychiatric establishment that their systems of classification and modes of reasoning should apply to everyone in the world, no matter what their background, their views of why they're on Earth, and all of that. So I'll come to that. I mean, Zimbabwe is a wonderful example where I just got back from. But just to start with, what do we mean by neoliberalism? We mean a political philosophy that's got an astonishing hold. To me, it's anti-humanistic philosophy, which is, broadly speaking, that what one is interested in is the individual with resources to disperse. And if he has resources to disperse, he's what the focus would be. He's praised. However rich he is, he's considered to merit all of that. And the flip side being that the poor and others who don't have resources to disperse and who need things are to be considered to be fallible and really not worth it. And in a sense, neoliberal philosophy more or less says to the political order, we don't need politics. The eternal wisdom and truths and verities of the market will determine what is funded, what is not funded. I'm astonished how far this has gone and how, in a sense, you can see it being traced through in international psychiatry. Not necessarily in the mind of those who promote international psychiatry, the kind of psychiatry I'm against, but it's there all the same. Quick example of that. There was, I think, a sociologist called Vida Skultans at the University of Bristol. She may have retired now. She wrote a wonderful piece in Social Science and Medicine a few years ago about Latvia, her home country. How Latvia had fared with the fall of the Iron Curtain and all of this, a country that had become much more insecure for most people when they had lost the kind of social security blankets which were available in the communist era. And what she described was the death of a category, a folk category in Latvia called Nervi, N-E-R-V-I, a common stem, obviously. Nervi was a kind of condition that you could go to the doctor about, and it probably had some various sort of psychosocial, psychomedical features, sleep, it had some physiological features, but Nervi embodied also a complaint about things outside of the space between your ears, things in society itself, so that bringing Nervi to the doctor was a part of a complaint about, lack of jobs or poor housing or whatever in the communist era. So what happened to Nervi? This is what happened. International pharmaceutical companies started to pay Latvian psychiatrists to come to conference to learn the diagnostic and statistical manual definition of depression, the book was DSM, the American classification system, was translated into Latvian, and the doctors, in a sense, were taught about depression, which they were then to teach to their patients and prescribe the pills. And so Vera Skulkin studied this, that somehow a folk category which embodied, in part, a focus on objective external social conditions in the society had been expunged in favor of a category where it was assumed that what the problem was lay between your ears only, and said nothing about society. And what she described was that looking at the narratives that were generated by these doctors and these patients, you could see the rise of an internalization of a heightened sense of personal responsibility for your position in life, your condition in life, a heightened sense of personal responsibility, reflecting the values of capitalist enterprise culture, reflecting those values. In other words, this was about reshaping everyday social identity for the average Latvian in the direction of a sort of politics-free psychiatric model. Not that, of course, the doctors who were doing this were thinking about neoliberal politics, but this is how it worked. Yeah. So that to me is a kind of abuse, the kind of globalization which was not asked for by Latvian people, and certainly one in which their social problems, which became in many cases much more pressing after the fall of the communist era, for better or worse, are no longer reflected in the idioms of distress. So narrative would be what we would call an idiom of distress. And it was being replaced by depression, which I think has become the primary idiom of distress in the Western world, evidenced by the fact that one adult in 7 in the UK and in the US today is taking an antidepressant, 1 in 7, and not just for a week like an antibiotic, but perhaps open-endedly. So what is that? Perhaps another example, just quickly before we move on to the meat of the matter. I was a PhD examiner of a wonderful PhD which was looking at the phenomenon of suicidal farmers in India. You might find this extraordinary, but in the last 25 years or so, nearly 250,000 small subsistence farmers have committed suicide, generally using the insecticide provided by the multinational Monsanto, which they repressed as part of a package. The Indian government persuaded a whole cohort of hundreds of thousands of farmers, more, to give up their traditional crops and to throw everything into genetically modified cotton, which meant they had to buy the seed from Monsanto, they had to buy the insecticide and the fertilizer. The seeds had to be reproduced every year because they were not self-regenerating as the traditional crops were. And basically, it didn't work. They were ruined. And these farmers, not knowing what to do with these huge debts, have been killing themselves with the last of the insecticide, which they had to buy to supposedly keep the genetically cotton plants going. What was the response of the Indian government to this? And indeed, reported as such in the Lancet without comment, India needs more psychiatrists. Yeah? So that's what I'm talking about. In the same PhD, the man recorded, the PhD candidate recorded overhearing an old woman standing outside a clinic, a poor old woman in a poverty-stricken part of India. The so-called community mental health program, they would send out a team of psychiatrists in their cars from urban centers, and they would tour these remote clinics where they would use Western categories like depression or whatever, not local Indian categories and idioms, and would prescribe medication. And she heard an old woman, the PhD student overheard a poor old woman saying outside the clinic, having just been in, I've got all these problems, and now they tell me I've got one more. There's something wrong with my brain. Yeah. So, which brings us in part into the kind of dogmas that are pushed by, if you like, the biological end of the Western mental health industry, that there is something wrong with the brains of people with schizophrenia or people with depression, only we can't quite pin down what it is. Yeah. And if we're looking about this sort of just as a place to move off from, how sound are the epistemological foundations of psychiatry? our generic category is something called a mental disorder. What is a mental disorder? The mind is an emergent property of brain, but it is not an organ. How can the mind be disordered? It's disordered in the way that one could say the British economy is disordered. In other words, in a journalistic and metaphoric way. So psychiatry has skipped what is essentially a philosophical problem, not a scientific problem. What is a mental disorder? By using the approach used throughout history by alchemists. Remember the medieval alchemists? They were convinced that they could get the right combination of base metals, lead, tin, copper, and fuse them together. Whoa, what would be born would be gold. Yeah, that's how psychiatry works. It takes a phenomenological approach. It clumps together categories. They are not clumped necessarily by nature so much as in the committee rooms of those people who are revising each edition of the American Psychiatric Association or the World Health equivalent, which is called ICD. So it's very much a constructed entity bypassing the problem. So this, and it is an exemplary Western cultural product. The way we think about mental disorder reflects Western biomedical thinking, which we are now exporting. Yeah. So where we go is from this. To me, one of these seminal trends in Western culture in the 20th century has been the rise of medicalization of everyday life and the demise of constructions and society figures to whom people previously turned, like religious or some kind of faith, or going to the priest or the old lady over the back fence or your local politician. All these figures have been, in a sense, demoted. What we have risen is a secularized psychology, which is meant to capture all the spiritual and other ailments of life. Ivan Illich, the wonderful, I suppose he was originally a Marxist sociologist, was writing about this in the 70s in a book that is still undated, still not dated, called Medical Nemesis. And I'll come back to that in a minute. By definition, when you medicalize something, if you turn someone who is very, very unhappy because they live in an insecure housing estate, the children pass cocaine dealers on the way to get to school, it's unsafe. When you recast that as depression, something has happened to the social and political roots of the problem. That's it. Yeah. Doesn't mean they're completely incompatible, but something has moved, rather like in the Latvian case, from open society, comprised of individuals, but connections between individuals, has moved into the space between the two ears of one individual. Yeah. So we have in Britain the Royal Colleges of General Practice and the Royal Colleges of Psychiatry, who do not contest the general term given about that 1 in 4 people in, say, in Britain or the US or Latvia or in Spain, 1 in 4 people at any one time are likely to have a mental disorder or be developing one. This to me is one of the most extraordinarily bizarre statements that could be possibly made. If 1 in 4 members of our society were mentally disordered, worthy of that name, how could society run? How could it run? How could buses run and parliaments and pubs? Nothing would run. It would gradually break down. But the medicalization of the world is a deep trend we see now. The growth of the size of psychology and psychiatry, how many people at any one time are practicing, how many are submitting themselves to it as patients. And it is, like global mental health itself, I'll move on to, reflects, when one comes to think about it, a neoliberal philosophy. Yeah, that society and politics and history, background politics, history, collectivities, society, culture, have no charge, have no purchase in a neoliberal world. The WHO, which in many ways is a very strange organization, too much funded by the drug industry. The WHO, in conjunction with the Lancet, the famous journal, in 2007, when the sort of global mental health field was more or less formally launched, made 3 statements, core statements, which captured what they felt was the need for a global mental health view. And I feel there's an abuse in this, just in this. The first one was that there are substantial numbers of mental disorders in the world, though largely hidden. largely hidden from the people who are supposed to be carrying them, is what I say. Number one. Number two, this is the WHO, that at any one time, 1 person in 3 in the world is developing or carrying a mental disorder, 1 in 3. I remember a friend of mine, Professor David Ingleby in the Netherlands, saying to me at the time, if someone believes that 1 person in 3 of the whole global population, let's just even say adults, is developing a mental disorder, they must be living on another planet, or I am. Yeah. And the third one was, because of this huge scale of untreated disease, not defined, there was a case to scale up mental health service. That means, by scaling up, means selling the products of the Western mental health system to the rest of the world, selling them, as it were, globalizing and selling. And that's what has happened. Going back to Ivan Illich then, writing in the 70s, who was a big critic of the power of the international health lobby and the international medical establishment, remarkably enough. In fact, the first line of the book, much quoted, is, the international medical establishment is the #1 threat to health in the world. Yeah. He talked about cultural iatrogenesis, which reflected the sense, and I think it's been seminal in the 20th century, that social assumptions about how tough the average citizen is, how resilient, how much endurance the average citizen can carry and still keep his or her shape, has changed through the 20th century. From an assumption, in fact, as recently as the 60s, from an assumption that the average person and the average child was basically resilient, and though they've been maybe knocked off of some awful tragedy, they will get over it. That was before the age of psychologists swarming over disasters and the role they had, for example, in the Bosnian War. I was a big critic of the psychologization of the Bosnian War, which had EU and UNICEF psychologists claiming that there were 3 million Bosnians who needed urgent treatment for their post-traumatic stress disorder, preposterous stuff. Illich argued that the more we think of the average citizen as being vulnerable, defined by vulnerability rather than by resilience, the more we're inducing what he called a kind of iatrogenesis. We are seeing ourselves as weaker and will become weaker. We'll become weaker. It'll be assumed we can't cope as we once thought we could. And with the world, you think of the world, what we're facing in the next 30, 40 years, you know, we really do need to stay tough. We can't just have a discourse around emotions or physiological changes that may signal emotional distress. He warned about what happens to the identity of the average citizen in a process where life is increasingly medicalized. There's more psychologists, more counseling, more psychiatrists, more medication, and all of that. Interesting enough, this process that I was describing in the 20th century and Illich too was nicely brought to a head by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, the #1 person in the church, the Worldwide Church of England. In the late 1990s, he made a speech in which he said, you know, it's sad now, in the past when people were going through some terrible period in their life, some crisis, they would turn to the church. The church gave pastoral care. They would come and speak to the priest. He said, now they don't do that anymore. They just go to counselors. So he's reflecting that same process, yeah? What we've got to remember about the whole discourse of the mental health industry is that once opinion formers and leaders, academic leaders, whatever, once they declare something to be real, it becomes real in its consequences, yeah? It becomes real in its consequences. If we are saying that 1 in 4 of a normal population, not even in wartime, is about to have or at risk or has a mental disorder, and they are supposedly coming from figures of authority in the universities and practitioners of stature, then the consequences of that declaration become very, very real. We can see that 1 in 7 on antidepressants, yeah. So that leads me then to our globalizing of the medicalization of everyday life initially as a Western cultural trend over the last decades. Interesting enough, I would mark the change to a view that we're vulnerable, not resistant, and not resilient, to as late as the 60s. In the 60s, probably the most famous peacetime disaster in this country was in a village called Aberfan in October 1966. A disused, massive coal-tipped slag, of discarded coal slag waste, which had been accumulating above the village for 200 years or so. The whole thing, loosened by rain, slipped into the village at school time and swallowed the school and swallowed 130 children and 28 teachers. That was a disaster. What is interesting is to see how unpsychologized, for better or worse, how unpsychologized that was a disaster. Of course, it was all over the newspapers. There were regular accounts about how the local people weren't asking for national aid. They and the neighboring villages were showing their toughness and resilience, and they were going to cope and manage this crisis. There was no psychologizing of it. There was no psychologist coming along saying, oh, the surviving kids will have PTSD forever or for a long time, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., which is what would happen today, and which I witnessed in when I was working for Oxfam in Bosnia. I persuaded Oxfam not to go down the counseling route, not to psychologize the Bosnian war, and to put their monies into what the survivors and victims there, for example, in a Muslim town called Tuzla, which was besieged, what did they want? Not what we wanted for them. And they did not want counseling, etc. So Oxfam heeded it. But just to say, the problem about taking a Western version of mental health, which of course is evolving even in the West, a Western version of psychiatry, Western categories of psychiatry, the problem that taking that abroad is that immediately, if you start to do research, you are confronted by the problem of validity, scientific validity. Validity in methodological research involving people, and when you're not studying their kidneys, which, unlike the mind, is an organ you can grip. You can get a grip on it. We're good at that. Yeah. But validity means that, valid research means that the questions you ask do not confront the nature of reality that those people are carrying in their own lives. So, I was recently doing some stuff in Cambodia, and I was interested to see that antidepressants were being sold, often one by one, in Cambodian supermarkets, and that the local doctors were beginning to recognize this word depression, which has previously had no place or exact equivalent in the Cambodian, in the lexicon of the Cambodian language, Khmer. I would say virtually all research done by white Western researchers on non-Western subjects in psychology and psychiatry and war studies, published in the high-impact journals. I'm mostly only familiar with the ones in English. I would say virtually all of them are invalid because they have brought methodologies which they have arrived from with the West that owe nothing to the local life world's understandings of everything, of what adversity means of local peoples. They are invalid. They are non-humanistic. They are useless. Useless. The global mental health world operates as if medical anthropology or any anthropology has never been discovered. They never cite texts in anthropology. Never. So the assumption, so here's an abuse. It's a built-in abuse that Western knowledge, it's an epistemological abuse, that Western knowledge is universal. Even in things like mental health, Western knowledge is universal. Local knowledge is only local. Yeah. So in Zimbabwe, where I've just got back, there is, of course, and always has been, a thriving traditional practice through faith healers, if you like, witch doctors, traditional healers, all of those sort of people. Yeah. Which ostensibly would be swept aside by the global mental health juggernaut. And so to consider Western knowledge universal and local knowledge local is to exemplify imperialism. Yeah, this is imperialism. I grew up in white Rhodesia at the end of the colonial period, and it was clear that local people were invited to invalidate their own sense of the world and to take on the sense of the world. They saw in the eyes of the white men who were their colonizers that was first-class knowledge. Their knowledge was local and second-class. And this is what Edward Said's definition of imperialism is, isn't it? That imperialism presents itself as an educational movement, setting out to modernize, develop, instruct, regulate, and civilize. That's what the global mental health movement, in effect, are doing. And that, to me, is an abuse. If you like, it's a political abuse, because only the Western order has the power to globalize itself. Yeah, I sometimes say to people, well, gosh, we love sending out, global mental health teams and councils all over the world. How would we feel if, after some disaster in Britain, or maybe after a bomb or something, 6 traditional Cambodian healers, who are called Khmer Kru, arrived at Gatwick Airport, and they've come to heal our trauma of the victims of the bomb explosions. And they brought their own methodologies, haven't they? They brought their karma charts, and their readings of the spirits, which they propose to use on us, because that's what they use. What I say to people, what would you feel about that? What would you feel about that? People say, well, I think, who the hell do they think they are? What do they know about us? But the other way around is another matter. Huh? It seems we know best. So I've written quite a lot, very antagonistic of global mental health. And it's interesting to see who comes back at you. Byron Good, a famous medical anthropologist who particularly made his name in studies in Iran and who's at Harvard, he wrote back to me and put in a book also that my kind of critique was almost unethical. So here we're going from I'm critiquing abuse, and he finds that critique itself unethical because my arguments would dissuade mental health programs going out to these countries which he feels they need. He, the anthropologist. So I don't know why there's that turn at Harvard, but there's one thing. I mean, to imagine that a global psychiatry, which means a Western cultural product psychiatry, can capture people anywhere, however colorful their cultural garments, is a sort of reductive caricature, isn't it? It's an intellectual embarrassment, apart from anything else. The idea that there's some universal biopsychosocial man, biopsychiatric man, there is no such person. Obviously, people can go mad all around the world in various sorts of ways for whatever it means, but those madnesses are not all the same. There is no one schizophrenia, for example, a category that's hugely overused in Zimbabwe. I'm speaking at a seminar reviewing the famous WHO studies of schizophrenia at an institute in Berlin next summer, which sounds very, very interesting. As you know, the WHO did a series of studies of schizophrenia in developed countries, so-called schizophrenia in developed countries and non-developed countries, Western countries, non-Western countries, like Nigeria was one of them. And to their using a standard methodology, assuming there's only one thing called schizophrenia, you can elicit with the same methodology anywhere in the world. And they found to their chagrin that if there was one schizophrenia in the world, then somehow it seemed to do better in Nigeria or South Africa than it did in Denmark or the US, which was embarrassing, and which they went to some trouble to take the sting out of. The problem was the problem they made at the outset. They assumed there was one disease, a unitary disease, schizophrenia, that way of going mad, and that one methodology would capture it. And they went around the world and they found, well, funny, I mean, how come they're better in Nigeria? They only got 2 psychiatrists in the whole country. There must be some mistake. Yeah. So the problem was, there are many schizophrenias, if you want to use that term. Madness in Zimbabwe in many ways has a whole different set of attributes and assumptions of origins from other parts of the world. So the abuse I'm talking about here is the assumption that the world can be fitted into Western categories and already running Western systems. And here we're talking about the psychiatric system. Yeah, I think for me, not just psychiatry and psychology in the Western, in the non-Western world, psychiatry, psychology, I feel are bloated categories and occupying too much of culture, even in the West. They're operating far beyond their explanatory models. The results they get are anodyne, to say the very least. You might say it's remarkable. We've had antipsychotics being given to so-called schizophrenics since, well, schizophrenics. I'm not denying the reality of madness since the 50s. So we've had 2 generations of people getting antipsychotics, which is supposed to be specific for schizophrenia. And so what are the fortunes today of people who are carrying the label schizophrenia compared to the 50s? They are much the same. Schizophrenics are, on the whole, are not closer to mainstream society than they ever were. They are not. Or more likely to be in parliament than they used to be, or working in the pub, or your accountant. They are not. As a social group, they remain excluded, stigmatized, whatever, disadvantaged, just as much, despite 50 years of drug treatment. So is that a success? Is that a success? Right, I'm going to stop in a moment. What's the time? 22. Just to recap, I'm interested in connecting the rise of neoliberal philosophy, which you can see not, of course, in medicine. You see it in all aspects of the social world, the way we look at social problems, the way we look at unemployed people and poor people in Britain and elsewhere. Yeah, I'm connecting the rise of that, the idea that people can do, if they do as well as they like, they are worthy of it, and if they don't, they're useless. I'm connecting that in an implicit way to the rise of the medicalization of everyday life, which shifts the moral economy, as I described in relation to Latvia, that somehow now people feel they are more responsible for themselves. It's not, and that somehow the shape of their thinking has to fit into the values of the capitalist enterprise culture. And I'm linking it to that and to the globalization of our medicalizing of everything, with the assumption that Western knowledge is first rate and universal, and non-Western knowledge is second rate and local. And the distortions that this throws up on the field, in projects out in Africa and elsewhere, and in the literature. And I'm suggesting that a great deal of the psychiatric literature which involves studying non-Western peoples is worthless and should be thrown out of the window. So at that point, I will stop for the moment. Are you there?
Thank you so much, Derek. Yes.
Sorry, did we lose transmission there or not?
No, that I am aware. I follow everything.
My screen went blank. Okay, fine. That's wonderful. Okay. I'll stop.
We start with the questions. Anybody want to jump in?
Looks like there's 15 people here.
Yes, they have been joining in between. Thank you so much. It's really interesting. And if there is nobody asking anything, I would like to know, in Zimbabwe, what is the concept of madness? Just to have an idea of contrast.
Just one second. Sorry. Hello. Sorry, Enric. There was some disaster at the front door. Right. Sorry, can you repeat your question? Something about madness in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, it is only to have a different perspective on the issues at hand, what they consider crazy, or whatever the concept they use, and what they acknowledge as such.
Well, throughout Africa, actually, clearly, madness can exist anywhere. By madness, we can call it psychosis. We like people who've taken leave of their senses. In Africa, there are 3 criteria that community studies show that points to people who might be considered mad. 3 categories. 1, people who are not intelligible. That is to say, people who they don't seem to be making sense suddenly. Number 2, unpredictable. They suddenly start doing things which, stripping off their clothes or just walking blankly down the road, which weren't predicted and not normal. And the 3rd is neglect of the social roles they should normally be performing. Those 3 things give you an outline of psychosis. Yeah. obviously, some aspects of psychosis you might find everywhere in the world, like some people can have deluded ideas, crazy ideas. The other category, the other symptom that is considered cardinal for most people for schizophrenia is, of course, hearing voices coming from outside, the way my voice is coming into your ears from outside. The trouble is, in Africa, hearing voices is an idiom of distress. And I saw a lot of African patients, largely women, with HIV in my NHS job for 16 years, very distressed in London and with all sorts of problems, plus HIV, and children with HIV threatened with deportation back to countries in Africa which didn't have HIV medication, therefore to die. And quite a number of them heard voices. As they were assisted socially, and their situation strengthened a bit, and the risk of deportation lessened, the voices faded. Yeah, they were an idiom of distress. They were not a symptom of psychosis. Of course, some people obviously may well be mad and hearing voices, but majority were not, and that's what one finds in Zimbabwe. Just to say, the white man came, and he only left in 1980 in Zimbabwe, and he left his systems behind, including psychiatry. So I conduct clinical seminars with fourth-year medical students, Zimbabwe medical students, in a place called Ingotsheni, which is one of the largest asylums in southern Africa, I think, built in the colonial era. And there you see some of the consequences of the worst of the white man's psychiatry, which the white man left behind. That the category schizophrenia, which is as stigmatizable in Zimbabwe as it is over here, is hugely overused for all sorts of problems. It is used, followed if they have it, by putting people on antipsychotic medication, which they must then go and buy. This is in a country with no economy. And so there is a social institution labeled schizophrenia, which arose from the colonial era. Most of those people should not have been given the diagnosis anyway. They may have had some transient thing. You know, schizophrenia implies chronicity. But they are lumbered now with this category, which can't easily be scraped off them. They're supposed to take all this medication. No one expects them to work again. And once created a huge pool of, if you like, institutionalized or non-institutionalized, I mean, in or out of the hospital, psychiatric patients, because of assuming that they must fit into the white man's textbooks. Yeah. Now, these people, I think some of these people are definitely disturbed. They are having, I think, they're having stress reactions which are culturally framed in many ways. All that is dumped. It took me only in my second year out there did I realize that the medical students, when they presented to me past medical history, having clerked the patients, never presented anything about whether the patient ever gone to see a traditional healer or anything. Why? Because they picked up, without anyone telling them, that talking about indigenous beliefs was not part of modernity. And learning to be a Western doctor is definitely a modernist exercise. And so they just left it out until I told them to. And then so under duress from me, they started to take a fuller history. And of course, a much richer story emerged, much richer. Yeah. Here's a test for you. Here's a question for you. Frans Fanon. So he was from Martinique, a colored man, but a French citizen. He did medicine and then he trained in psychiatry and he went to work in Algeria, which was then a colonial possession, as you know. There were two groups of psychiatrists working there. One were French, i.e. they'd grown up in metropolitan France, qualified in metropolitan France, and had gone out to the colony, Algeria, to work. The others were Algerians. Of course, French speaking, but Algerians. They'd grown up in Algeria and done medicine in Algeria and were working there as psychiatrists. He asked them, he separated them into two groups and asked them the same question. And this is the question I bring to my medical students just a few weeks ago. He asked the two groups, what do you think of traditional healers and faith healers and traditional birth assistants and bone setters and wise old women, you know, that stuff. Indigenous knowledge, indigenous attitudes to adversity. What do you think of it? He asked both groups. Well, both groups, he reported that both groups were extremely negative. They were very negative and dismissive of traditional healing and all that sort of thing. But one group was much more dismissive than the other. Which was it? So I tell the story to my medical students in Zimbabwe a few weeks ago. I say, who do you think were the most dismissive of native practice in that? The French doctors or the Algerian doctors? Well, they are all too young to remember the colonial era, but they know the dynamics of it. And the whole class says, oh, of course, the French doctors. Wrong. It was the Algerian doctors. Fanon reported the Algerian doctors seemed to have to more to prove, to show they were fit to turn the key in the lock of modernity, as he put it. Yeah, they felt they had to much more vigorously dump local stuff to show that they were the equivalent to metropolitan France. So this is these are the issues. I would think, Western knowledge and Western systems, Western understandings of a person are like a tide that has swept over the world. And in so doing, they have squashed out a whole range of diversities and attitudes to care and society and all of that, which I think amount to an abuse. That's all.
Thank you. Please, anybody that wants to ask, go ahead.
Hi.
Hello, Tamar.
Hello. I guess when I think about just this meeting, even, I just wonder, how do we contend with the problem that people who work in psych, researchers, clinicians, and so on in the West are not even educated at the most basic level on any of the liberal concepts that you're discussing and that we're all discussing? There's a total shift away from literally studying history, art, exposure to art, literature, philosophy, political education just seems to direct people into the legal profession or into politics, and it's all totally ahistorical. It's like all about STEM, science, technology, and everything else is just totally undermined and unappreciated, like from kindergarten.
Sure. I share your pessimistic view. Of course, it's hardly restricted to the health sciences. In UK at the moment, we have a government that have made it clear that they want to defund, or at least diminish, courses at university which are like soft arts, which don't lead to jobs necessarily. And that the measure of the worth of university courses is what proportion of their graduates are in full-time work within 2 years, that kind of. So we're in an age of Philistinism, but so it's running right across, to me, it's running right across the polity. You could say in many respects, when you come back to the health sciences, that what we witness is the triumphalism of the idea of the technical mind. The technical mind has made these spectacular advances in the world since 1650. It's hard for us not to think that investigating the mind might be a bit like, the first bridge builders. We think like that. I think that it's all fundamentally a misnomer that we can investigate mind, this virtual space, using the techniques that we apply to physical medicine, the body, which assume a pathway or pathways which lead to destinations. As far as I'm concerned, there's no destination in mind. It's a nonsense. The mind is a philosophical space. There isn't a destination to get at it. Obviously, it all comes from brain in the end. But as you know, everyday psychiatry and psychology operates very little in the realm of physical medicine. When I was in the HIV field, of course, I would see people with HIV dementias or HIV brain infections. Now, those are definitely diseases. Those are diseases, I tell my students. But depression, schizophrenia, all that, where we can find no reproducible biological changes in the brain, those are merely syndromes. Those are phenomenological constellations constellated by psychiatrists in rooms, not by nature. So, but these, you can see the same pressures operating in education system. You know, neoliberal thinking has infused the whole of society in many ways. We've become less interested in socialist ideas, in collectivities. You know, trade unions are weaker, and healthcare and certainly psychiatry and psychology, which are quintessentially cultural products, have followed down the same path. But I share your pessimism, Tamar. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, thank you again.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what the silence means, because I can't see anyone. That's right.
On my end, is waiting for somebody else to jump with the next question. And if not, I'm going to ask myself, what would you do if you were to have any say in the education system to correct this?
Education, you mean medical education?
I would say society-wide. But yeah, go for the medical as well. Go.
Why the wider question is difficult. The medical, I think we need to training in medicine, and specifically, of course, in psychiatry, psychology, needs to pay far more attention to the output of medical anthropologists. Yeah? Medical anthropologists deal with collectivities, with background values. You know, that would be the first thing. And the deconstruction of the power of Western knowledge, that it can globalize itself, but should it? You know, much more honesty of that kind, plus more honesty about really how few breakthroughs have ever been made in psychiatry. Yeah, functional psychiatry. I'm distinguishing here between organic psychiatry, which is the psychiatry of physical illness, like a chest infection causing a confusional state, a delirium, and functional psychiatry, which is what most psychiatry is operating in, which is the psychiatry of syndromes which we've cobbled together. Depression, bipolar, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, all of those are syndromes. Doesn't mean they're not real issues there for the people who are carrying those problems, howsoever named, of course. I'm not putting that down. But it's been submitted to quite a rigid ideology, which insists that the problems are essentially technical.